Hello, Barry.
Well,
Hi,
I'm
Mark.
Hi, Stacy. How are you?
Terrible. I'm going to stay off camera. I'm really sick.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
Um, Barry, I just heard of you yesterday from Jack after you met him uh, in yesterday's meeting. I'm working closely with him on SenseCraft. It seems I missed something yesterday. Oh well, but I am looking forward to hearing more.
I'm willing to spill the beans on anything you're interested in.
Let's see, maybe we shouldn't monopolize the conversation twice. Uh, are these recorded? Could I
Yes,
listen?
yes. In
Yes.
fact, you probably have a notice that it's at the top that it's being recorded.
Yes, yes, yes. So
Um,
maybe I should try to get hold of yesterday's recording.
It's
Sam,
up. It's
Sam
up.
up,
Watched it. I started watching it.
Sam uploads these to YouTube under his account.
Okay, I'll look for that. Are we waiting for quorum?
I'm not sure who or what we're waiting for.
We are the ones we're waiting for.
Sam is connected, but he doesn't have his camera on.
I see.
It's only 8 a.m. for Sam, so he's usually a little bit slow getting started at this hour. Oh yeah, he wrote, need 5 minutes, just woke up. And then he has to do his morning ablutions. So, yeah, just as I predicted, he's running late-ish.
So maybe we should get into. So I don't know um, where the discussion went exactly. What I understand is you've been looking at the emotional states accompanying learning.
Yes.
Uh, I've been looking for. Uh, okay, hang on. I've been looking also for rules that help me uh, identify pro-social behavior in collective sense-making situation. I'm not sure rules is the best way to do it. One thing I've been working on a lot is actually mutual scoring because rules are gamed, but mutual scoring, it's about, yes, of course, it can be gamed by coalitions, but it's more about getting others to agree that you've contributed something significant, which I think is a good thing. And also at looking for evidence of higher level sense making, such as going meta and things like that, and using doing exercises in synthesizing many positions uh, and good rephrasing, good formalization of someone else's ideas as a way to advance a conversation. These are signals. No signal is absolute. Uh, I'm looking for signals, and certainly in a even in a competitive game, I don't know how much the emotions can be dissembled and gamed on the competitive aspect, but I think I shouldn't worry too much about that. Certainly, if it has anything to do with learning, there's definitely something to observe. The I have believed always looking at the evolution of agree disagree, but also of seeking clarity is a good thing. Deep democracy has gone deep into trying to understand the underlying reasons and that way pushing into why the discomfort. And that's really the value of emotional. But I'm sure, okay, I'm talking enough about what I know. I'm curious about what you know.
Well, the first thing I would say is that the search for rules is probably looking in the wrong direction. The next thing after rules, the next element after rules is called protocols. And anybody who's interested in the internet or familiar with the internet knows that the internet is a protocol-based system, not a rule-based system. And for the average person, they may not appreciate the distinction between a rule and a protocol, but it's a humongous distinction. A protocol is a negotiation for finding mutually agreeable parameters for engagement, as opposed to somebody on high who sets down hard and fast rules and everybody is obliged to obey them or else.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that concept, that rule-based concept, which dates back, I'm going to say 6,000 years in human culture, is probably the biggest mathematical mistake humans have ever made in crafting a regulatory mechanism that's functional and effective. And the main problem with rules is that not only are they rigid, but if you violate them, then they call for some kind of sanction or punishment, which is state-sponsored violence under the color of law. And that is a terrible, terrible idea that only our species, Homo sapiens, have invented. Animals don't do that. And computer networks, technology systems don't do it that way. You know, if a computer misbehaves, they don't indict it and try it and convict it and punish it. They simply diagnose, its departure from the protocols and either disconnect from it or correct it. But it's nonviolent. And so the first thing is
no objection so far.
Okay. So the thing is to move away from rules into protocols. And there's actually a whole sequence of stages that starts with rules at the bottom, which is basically kindergarten. And then protocols the next level up. And there's 3 more levels that you can increment to after that. And this is one of the things I wrote up some years ago. So you go from rules up, work up to protocols next. After protocols comes functions. And this is important because a function is a concept that comes to us from mathematics. And most people are not very adept at mathematics. They don't really know what a function is. You say, ask somebody, what's the function? No, that's where you get together and have wine and cheese and schmooze with people. That's not what we mean by functions.
I have a math background, so go for it.
Yeah. Right. And so protocols rely on functions as part of the negotiation, trying to find functions that do the job. And the main thing about functions is, how do you craft a function that works? Well, the next level up after functions are called models. And in model-based reasoning, most of the models are characterized in terms of underlying functions. So if you define a model in terms of functions, then you can solve the functions mathematically for optimal practices that get you to the goal that you want as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And in optimization theory, the whole idea is find the function that characterizes the system and then solve it mathematically for best practices, either analytically or by some simulation or whatever method you need. And the next higher level after models is systems. And when you're doing systems thinking, you're thinking in terms of models, and models are constructed out of functions, and functions give you protocols, which are negotiations. Our species is operating at the rule level, mostly. We're operating the kindergarten level. The technology systems are working their way up through protocols, functions, models, and systems. And that's the direction we need to migrate to, not just for technology systems, non-living systems, but for socio-political, cultural systems as well. And we've been stumbling along for 6,000 years or longer with this rule-based and crime and punishment regulatory mechanism, which is idiotic as hell and violent as hell.
I almost misspoke when I said rules, because I'm designing a game, I'm using that vocabulary, but I definitely don't want to be making a rule-based system that way. And I did correct and say indicators and patterns. Now, I don't think patterns are probably closer to the protocol level than to the model level, but they're kind of in between.
Yeah.
I am a bit curious about when you say a model is made of functions, you're thinking very much like a systemic model, dynamic models.
Exactly.
But the functions in a dynamic model are mostly system properties as opposed to what people can learn to model. See, there's the point of emergent behavior is that people obey very simple patterns at the micro level, and then you can observe and infer emergent patterns in which you will identify those model functions. But those model functions are not close to the micro level not rules, but patterns of behavior. Let me put it this way.
Yeah. Yeah. People are pretty good at pattern recognition. And once you see a pattern, that makes it easy to predict what your opponent, let's say in a game, is going to do. And if you can anticipate what your opponent is going to do, then you can choose a defense or another mechanism that exploits the weakness of that pattern. And a lot of games are basically, operate on the notion of, if you can recognize, it's like rock, scissors, paper. If you can see a pattern, you can choose the option that's best against that pattern. So that's one thing that we have in our favor. We can do pattern recognition, but our pattern recognition is kind of intuitive. It's not very technical, and it's not adaptive. That if people change their pattern, if they change up on you, then you're kind of lost in the woods again, and got to start all over again, finding, you take a lot of data before you get the next level of the pattern.
I don't think anything is adaptive in that exact way, right?
No, it's too slow. The adaptation is way too slow.
No, but I mean, even ideal perfect mathematical adaptation machine has to take time to discover the new pattern.
Yep. Yep. And that's one of the.
You can argue humans are slower than that, and that's a valid point. But what I'm saying is, even the theoretical maximum, it takes time.
Yeah, but this is one of the places where affective states or emotions come into play, because if somebody departs from their pattern, you notice that there's something odd about them, and you're surprised or confused or perplexed or discombobulated. Yes. So you have an emotional reaction to the departure from a pattern, and that's a clue. That emotion is a clue that the model that you're working from, or the pattern that you're relying on, is no longer valid or as valid as it once was, and therefore you have to do some research and modify your mental model. So there's always the notion that the emotions are one of the indicators or clues of the departure from expectations.
Sounds perfectly correct.
And that leads to metacognition, which is, how do you make effective use of the analysis? How do you analyze this emotion-driven disturbance to optimally upgrade your understanding of the model of the system, so that you can adapt as effectively and efficiently as possible? So there's something called metacognition, which is sort of driven in part by this emotion and learning dynamic, this interaction of emotions to learning.
We extend this notion of learning to participation and engagement.
I interrupted. I'm sorry, Sam. Can you say that again?
No, I interrupted you. But I was saying, rather than confine this all to just this domain of learning, there is an entire area, a space of engagement and participation where these dynamics are also at play.
Yeah. If you don't participate, you don't get much data.
Right. So I'm just trying to say, instead of learn, we can also say engagement is equally plausible when we state what we're stating here.
Somebody wanted to ask a question a minute ago.
Yeah, this is Martin. My name is Martin. The question I wanted to ask, it's more of a statement, and then I wanted to get a response. But in terms of measurement, I like what we were talking about earlier with the rules versus protocols, et cetera. But it's always seemed to me that what comes with the rules-based system is sort of a policing type approach.
Exactly.
Right? Which is, and in a lot of ways, that's really intended to prevent bad behavior. We have to police you to make sure that bad behavior doesn't occur. I mean, obviously, some of it is after the fact, but that's versus what I would call uh, I'm not sure what I would call it, but if you let people work together and there is a problem, they can resolve it themselves. It's really more of a self-compliance, a self-regulation maybe on this. So it's really more being able to measure and identify non-compliance rather than a policing of a system. And so I kind of wanted your thoughts on that. Am I on the right track with my thinking
Yeah,
in terms of the kinds of things we want to measure?
yeah. The notion of policing violations of rules is a very old, very primitive, and very unmathematical idea. It's a very poor regulatory mechanism. And that's why one of the whole goals of systems thinking is to evolve out of that anachronistic crime and punishment, policing and sanction paradigm. That's a terrible paradigm. It's not. It's dysfunctional. It's violent. It a friend of mine says we don't break the rules. The rules break us. That's one way of putting it. And so moving up the ladder to a negotiation. And so if somebody behaves in a way that's disturbing, you can say, well, I'm disturbed by that. You can disclose your affective state, that you're alarmed or disturbed or concerned. And that can lead into a discussion and negotiation and an amicable resolution of a adjustment to the paradigm, which is not locked into some hard and fast rules that are handed down by some deity or stone tablet.
And it seems like it assumes there's some good faith with the people or systems executing, whatever, process or whatever, executing the system, so to speak, implementing it. Yeah, I mean, this is part of what the problem we have. But I wanted to bring this back to the measurement because it seems like non-compliance, and maybe I'm mistaken here, maybe I'm being naive, is easier to measure than, or maybe it's a deeper measurement, a more realistic measurement than, because something's not working, and the response to it is maybe more. Well, let me leave it there.
It's definitely easier to judge a departure from a hard and fast rule than an affective state that is a reaction to unexpected behavior. And so what's missing is a level of enlightenment or level of mindfulness. Rules don't require a whole lot of mindfulness. I mean, you have an umpire, a judge, a referee, a policeman, whose job it is to witness a departure from a rule and then intervene. And if you get rid of that mechanism, then you have to have more of a peer-to-peer process. And that peer-to-peer process means empathy, among other things, and emotional intelligence, and more flexibility in adapting and evolving to the parameters of engagement. Sam has his hand up, and so does Mark.
Okay. So let me say 3 things. First of all, I'm glad you guys are going. It seems like you have momentum. Sorry I was late in waking up this morning, but it sounds like many of you, most of you, got briefed on why each of you is here, and that there's a couple of communities now meeting each other through these last few weeks. The second is for those in the TopicQuests camp. I've been having this conversation with Barry now for a few years. And I still think that there are nuances and implications here to some of what's being said, even today, that I still am struggling to understand, because to me, the distinction between rules and patterns and protocols, well, at a very high level, can be understood, is not as precise as I would like to have it in my mind, okay? For example, protocols can be said to be based on rules as well. In fact, if you have any left-hand side of any condition, that's a pattern. Those can be, the if side of things. And I come from a symbolic AI background where I do understand patterns. I do understand rules. I do understand protocols. And the distinction between rules and protocols is not yet firmly entrenched in my understanding. I see the generalities, but look at protocols like TCP and SMTP and others. If certain conditions are not met, the function to which that protocol has been defined doesn't execute, does not, provide value to that transaction. If there is a denial of service attack, that violates certain protocols of web self-protection. If there are certain values out of whack in the TCP headers for any request, then it doesn't get followed up on. Those octets get trashed. So that's, you could say, a non-violent reaction, but maybe not, because the denial of service could result in another engagement, which is an entirely shut off of the attacking multitude of requests. So I think for me, I'm still trying to understand this spectrum from rules all the way up to models, and then all the way up to wherever else Barry is taking this. Now, that's not for me to detract from the basis of this model. It's for me to try and understand more about why these distinctions exist. And thirdly was that thing that I added about, I think this is applicable not only to learning, but to every engagement, because every engagement between entities is an opportunity to learn. So you could say learning is the opportunity to take any feedback, any and all feedback from the transaction, from the experience, from whatever you're attempting to do, and then to apply yourself to some sort of self-cognition, this retrospective notion, so that either you improve what's going on in real time, or you improve the next attempt to try and do this, and all subsequent other attempts. So anyway, I just wanted to say, I'm still trying to struggle. It's not quite as simple as the first declaration of it would seem. And yet I still think there's value here for us to engage. So anyway, that's my way of saying good morning and welcome. And if anybody is unclear about the participation of some of these people on the session today or previously, please speak up, and either I or Jack or Barry or anybody else can actually step forward and try and put that in context. Over.
Marc-Antoine has his hand.
Do you want first to respond to the Sam's question, or should I? I have.
I'll just say one thing. One of the key identifiers of a rule is that its grammatical structure is if ... then ... or else ... and that presence of the or else clause is the sanction of the punishment, and that's done by an outside authority. And negotiation doesn't have that that kind of an or else clause that's so rigid and so hurtful that it has a sort of implied sanction. So if you see a rule written as if, then, or else, think, how can we replace that by something that's more graceful, more peaceable, more negotiable? That's a better protocol than a crude, kindergarten level if, then, or else.
I'm sorry, I'm not buying that last one, but that's not the main point. I'm not buying that last one because obviously any else clause can become an if clause. The problem is the violence.
Yes,
and there I agree with you. The problem is not it being defined as a rule. The problem is that the consequence contains violence.
Exactly.
Whether it's in the then clause or the else clause or whatever, it's perfectly irrelevant.
It's this kind of or else that's the problem. It's the
or then that's it's there I'm with you. On the other hand, the one model of communication I read once that I found extremely useful and fascinating was someone trying to go a bit beyond game theory and saying in game theory is based on the idea of non-communication, the basic prisoner's dilemma, there's no communication. And in many systems you have, and there he was very clear, those are rules. You're expected to do a certain thing, and there are social norms. Like he put it in terms of social norms. He was using Talcott Parsons' idea of social norms. There are social norms that you're expected to follow. And when you break a social norm, there's three scenarios. One is you were being a selfish ass. And then there's actually a social norm that people will try to sanction that even at cost to themselves. So, which is already, that's observable. And that's a proof that people are not following pure game theoretic action because they'll do it at cost to themselves. But for the, enforcing the social norm is seen as an acceptable collective cost to bear or even individual cost to bear so that we get the collective benefit of a social norm. And usually the benefit of social norm is coordination. It's easier to coordinate if you know that what to expect from one another. So that's case one. But the three cases are really important. There are social circumstances where self-interest is accepted. The typical example, of course, is the market. In the market, you're expected to be self-interested. It's fine. It's not. There's no social norm being violated there. There's actually a social norm of expected self-interest. That's fine. And the third possibility, and really the most interesting one, is that you had to violate a social norm because there was another social norm at play. Because social norms are not always perfectly aligned and there's overlap, and sometimes there's, such things as higher truth or higher principles that are at play that make. And so this person was arguing, and that argument may or may not be valid, that the distinction between case one and case three, between I broke that social norm because fuck society, versus I broke the social norm because there was another principle at play, and don't sanction me because I'm still working within the social framework, even though I broke this one social norm, I was obeying this other one, might be one of the most important motivations for higher level communication and abstraction, and might have been even evolutionary drive for evolution of language. Now, I'm not speaking to that hypothesis. It may or may not be true, but I think it's a fascinating distinction. I think that the drive to enforce social norms is extremely important for all kinds of reasons. As I said, coordination. On the less positive side, schismogenesis. I mean, humans are extremely tribal and can be extremely violent. And the ability to say this is our social norms and those people's are whatever derogative thing you might say because they're doing this horrible thing that we forbid, but they're following their own social norms. That's that's part of the tribalism, and that's a problem. Fair enough, I think so. But the notion that social norms are part of what allows coordinated action without a ridiculous communication overhead. But expectations. Now, sometimes social norms need to be broken also for society to evolve and adapt. I'm not saying you always have to blindly follow social norms. I'm with you about the rigidity is the other part of the problem. Violence is one part of the problem. Rigidity is the other part of the problem. And we need to be extremely empirical about what social norms should be to obtain a desired behavior in a given social environment and natural environment. And we may discover that some of our social norms work or some don't. And being able to break some of them is necessary for adaptation also. But the notion that in general, in normal period, like we have normal science versus paradigm shift, in normal historical periods, it is beneficial for society if people overall obey social norms, except again in legitimate reserved space like the market, except when there is a valid, and this is what law is about, like was there a valid reason for this person to do this action that hurt that other person? I mean, this is, and why there's argument around this that may be very valid. It's not just whether we should put that person in prison, which I agree can be problematic. Sometimes it's important. I mean, sociopaths exist. But also to say, even from a reparative justice standpoint, which I believe strongly in, why did you do this? I want to understand. and that's part of the process of negotiation, of which you speak about in the protocol world. So violence, excessive violence in response to rule breaking can be problematic, not always. It can be, it's certainly overdone right now. I'm not arguing that out. But I don't think that's a hard and fast rule either. I think we're all dealing with heuristics. Patterns are a way to recognize applicable heuristics and hopefully to know when does this heuristic apply or not apply. And that's why I love patterns in the sense of, Alexander or Gang of Four design patterns, is because they made it really clear that the pattern is a product of forces. And this pattern is right in when the forces are this way, and maybe not applicable when the forces are different. And I found that wonderful as a way to think about rules, as opposed to pure, this is how we do things. Now, the empiricism I speak of, like what are the behaviors that, for me, my goal when designing SenseCraft is how can we get people to find better solutions? And for me, it's a known empirical fact. There's literature on that people find better solution when they get to iterate on each one another's solution than the best solution that any one person could have found. In many cases, not always, but in many cases. Overall, that's a known empirical fact. So getting people to criticize constructively and iterate and understand one another is a desirable behavior. So now I am looking for teaching that pattern, and to teach that pattern, I have to recognize it. And hence I'm looking at what are the pro-social behaviors, pro-social defined in exactly the terms that what will allow a group of people to find common solutions. And sometimes common solutions will be agree to disagree, and that's fine. But common solutions that are better than what any of them found on their own, or what they could agree with a shallow conversation, and especially a shallow conversation in there, I'm totally with you, that is about one subset, no matter how large, dictating that this is the way things should be and to the others. That's not optimal. But optimality, I think, is about finding common ground and what are the indicators and what are the behaviors that will lead to finding common ground. And can this be taught? Can this be recognized? Can this be identified? And this is the kind of game rule I'm trying to make is, and of course, it has to be a collaborative, also that has to be a collaborative endeavor. I expect the players to identify new rules and to say, I think this behavior that looked good in general doesn't work in this case, and maybe we need to refine the rule. Or maybe there's this entirely new behavior we could try out and see if it helps us getting better insights. The rules will never be definitive in that sense. And that's why the mutual understanding is much more important than any rule I can come up with. But on the other hand, I have a very clear idea of what behavior I'm trying to drive at. And I'm working, that's never going to be definitive, on what I believe are the likely behaviors I think are worth teaching so far as a way to achieve practice of that is conducive to that result. But I have lots to learn about that, and I expect to learn from my players. And I want to learn from you how to involve emotions in that. But anyway, I was trying to put the notion of sanction and negotiation in a slightly different context. I hope that was at least interesting. The book is by Joseph Heath. I'll give the quote.
I'm going back to social norms, and most people are aware of the prominent social norms in our culture, and also aware of the fact that some social norms are counterproductive or at least suboptimal. When I look at something like what's present and what's problematic about what's present, I ask myself, what's absent that would be better if it were present? It's something just completely absent. And in terms of social norms, I can think of two social norms that I fervently wish were present in our culture, which aren't. And before I say what they are, I'll give people chances to guess what I have in mind. What social norms would be lovely to have, but aren't commonly present in our culture?
Certainly asking why, the motivation of choice of actions. Like, really, asking why did you do this instead of inferring, oh, you did this because you're a terrible person. That is one that comes to my mind.
So openness, you're saying openness to diagnostic reasoning, diagnostic insight.
Yeah.
And that's not one of the ones I had in my head. What I had in mind is a much higher level, not so specifically detailed as that. Anybody else want to take a guess? Go ahead.
I value diversity of opinion as an overall social norm. For me, diversity is a plus following Ashby, and valuing diversity is for me a norm.
What I have in mind are things that I really, really wish were much more prominent practices and social norms. And the two that I have in mind are ethics and empathy.
Meta norms, but yes.
It would be lovely if emotional intelligence, which is how you learn empathy, and ethics were part of the curriculum or the education of our culture, and they're not. I mean, if you want to take a course in ethics, it's at the graduate level in places like Harvard. Okay,
In the philosophy
and
department.
Daniel Goleman has been trying to get emotional intelligence into the curriculum for decades. He hasn't succeeded. Go ahead.
Very quickly, because Sam has his hand up. A lot of people pretend that we get ethics from religion class, and sometimes it's an approximation, sometimes it's problematic. I was in the Quebec curriculum. It's mandatory that people be given the choice of either religious class, catechism, or moral education. Because of laicity principles, you can, as at kindergarten, get a moral education class. And we certainly, in those classes, were considering ethics dilemma. I was amusingly in a school that was once owned by a religious order and then took on lay status, and hence was exempted from that rule of not having to impose religious studies. And I had to do religious studies as a consequence, which is totally ridiculous. And we certainly were looking at ethics dilemma in some of those classes. Some of them were more historical. I still resent the class, but I was taught ethics. maybe a US problem, but I totally agree. Teaching empathy, I think, is even more important because ethics often, unfortunately, ends up taking the form of rules as opposed to, say, Kantian imperative, which I think is so much interesting.
That's why it's graduate level. Real ethics is graduate level stuff. It's deep reasoning.
Yes.
Wisdom. So it might be easier to introduce emotional intelligence in the curriculum, and therefore make it much more commonplace for people to be able to recognize affective states of their correspondence and have some empathy for them. I'd love to have those as social norms. Very true. Sam,
1000% true.
Barry, just curious to see whether you see the participation in the screen and whether or not people have their hands up.
well, I can see it
Anyway.
right on the main screen. I
All
see
right,
you have your
then 2 points. 2 points then. Again, this is getting to the root of why I have had some difficulty really grokking what's going on here. Because whatever is in the if clause is being generalized, in my opinion, a bit too much. So in other words, what I would like to see is in a society where we have some discussion regarding objective or vision or strategy or values, whatever the goodness is, you know, the motherhood, the apple pie that we really want to enjoy together. If we say that, and I'm pointing to my upper right because that's out there, you know, it's not right here because apparently, you know, we don't have it yet. That's why we want it. If it's that thing that we want, then it's that thing we ought to be able to communicate among ourselves to say, well, we should all want some apple pie. Okay. Now, if we're all wanting apple pie, then that's a clause on the left-hand side. If we all want apple pie, then okay, now you get to do something, I get to do something, we all get to do something. We could all figure it out. But that clause is valid. We understand it. Okay. And if you say we have an if then else construct to anything, whether it's a rule or a partial protocol, I don't see what's necessarily bad about that. There's no inherent badness in that formalism of an expression related to another expression related to other expressions. Okay. And that's my problem with rules, is that the characterization that I hear being discussed here is that rules are bad. Now, that got further refined when it was, it ain't so much rules, it's negative consequences, like, you know, power over. Okay. I hear that. And I agree with that. Okay. In general. Okay. So I just wanted to point out again, that is my difficulty with this rule formalization that seems to always crop up. Because I agree with protocols, I agree with adaptability, I agree with the fact that we have to have more sophisticated behavior among each other. But, you know, even in protocols and rules, I can adjust, even given the expression of a rule. I can say, okay, rather than setting 8 bytes, I'm going to set 64 bytes because it's more efficient. Okay. Now, that's not something that is negated or even bad simply because it's stated in the rule. So I'll just make that point one more time. The second point here is about diversity of opinion. Okay. This is where I think democracy is its own demise. I think the fact that we welcome all opinions is kind of a primitive notion. We should welcome valid opinions. And I have a very strong position on this. If it can be shown that your opinion is, let's say, hypocritical in some sense with whatever construct or whatever perspective or whatever language you choose to use, or whatever set of definitions you choose to use, I should be able to criticize and you should have to explain or defend. Okay? Because otherwise, it doesn't hold water, quote unquote. Now, I know that's a very, very controversial point. Because if somebody doesn't agree with my position, my perspective, my language, et cetera, they could say, oh, well, we don't have to agree with that. But I'm saying, no, you don't have to agree with mine. You just have to be self-consistent within your own perspective, your own definitions, your own frame of reference. And if you cannot do so, and I can point out where you are not, then why should I have to abide or give respect or time to an opinion which in its own model doesn't make sense? If we allow nonsensical opinions to have voting power, then we get the idiocy that we get today. So I think there is a notion of valid opinion that must be introduced. And I know that's controversial. I tried saying this when I was 5 years old. I'm saying it now at 65, and I'll keep saying it, okay? because not all opinions matter. Some opinions really are objectively and provably stupid and invalid. So diversity is fine when it comes to valid opinions, but when it comes to invalid opinions, they can be mocked, they can be disregarded, and those people who firmly agree with them should be given less influence in society. Over.
Mark, your hands up.
Yeah. I struggle with this both ways. I was recently in a conversation with Martin. I was saying, well, US has tried absolute free speech, and Europe, until recently, had not, anti-hate speech laws, and managed to keep the Nazi under control for a bit longer. And it could be argued, I don't know if it's true, that the Nazi uprising in Europe is also due to the fact that the anti-hate speech laws in Europe have become ineffective with the intrusion of American social networks in the public sphere. Is that said, it's also obvious to me that that's the empiricism I'm talking about. What works to prevent the rise of Nazism, and what's the right position to free speech? It's also obvious to me that stupid position need to be part of the public discourse to be debunked. I mean, there is going to be a moment where anything you don't allow is driven underground. And if there's no way we can explain why Nazism is wrong, and that does mean confronting the Nazi arguments in the open, as an example. It's not the only one, of course. Flat Earth, whatever. You're going to get it will fester, or you will get the hidden polite dog whistles. You'll get the dog whistling. There's been a lot of pseudo intellectuals selling racist, new pseudo scientific racist arguments in a very, many layers of obfuscation around it, or sometimes not, or sometimes less layers of obfuscation as the Overton window moves. Thinking of Peterson, of course, but not only him. It's the problem with stupid ideas is it's very hard to make a rule about them. I'm also a fan of Feyerabend explaining how the ideas that are obvious to us now were obviously wrong at some point to any reasonable person. He gives the example of Galileo. It's difficult, like finding the right balance, because I think it's a balancing act between. I do totally believe in deplatforming hate speech, as opposed to, and when you said less influence, I'm a bit more comfortable. I've always been saying representative democracy is absurd. I've always been pro deliberative democracy, where everybody can add to the conversation, but then we can have a representation of the global conversation where we can show this and this and this is very well disproven by fact, and then look at the remaining options and say, okay, this is where we want to go, no matter how popular this absurd idea is. But I don't know if that would work. Like if Hitler got elected, Trump got elected, sometimes Nazism is relatively popular. But of course, that got enabled by absolute control of platforms. And the question of deplatforming versus forbidding speech is, and that's close to the punishing rules versus let's just stop communicating with these people thing Mary was talking about, is absolutely valid. For me, what's important about democracy is less than one person, one vote, that everybody can participate. All decisions have to be transparent. Everybody can say, you know what, this is not wrong for me, and here's the reasons. And no reason should be excluded from the public discourse. Everybody should feel that they have something to contribute. That's my definition of democracy, not the most classical one. But I mean, democracy used to include sortition, it used to include all kinds of things other than the current model. Over. But yes, we have to be empirical about it. That's absolutely.
Sam?
So what's really at play here in a big, big, big metacognition level is whether we value truth or whether we value power more. There's a certain element in society that clearly doesn't regard truth as important, and all they regard as important is power. So having reasoning and logic and evidence and facts presented to power is mocked at because they don't care. Okay. We have to understand that, going from might is right to truth is right is a leveling up. It's an opportunity for the entire planet, but led hopefully by this particular species. We're not doing a good job of it. But if we want to, it has to be a level up opportunity taken seriously. And until we recognize that reasoning and transparency don't matter to those who value only power, we're going to be wasting our efforts. So those of us who do care will engage based on truth and reasoning and social norms and model-based reasoning and critical reasoning and science and mathematics. But we also have to, if we're going to use our intellect, have an approach that deals and confronts power. And that's what's sometimes distasteful to those of us who really want to just focus on pushing the boundaries of truth. That is the fundamental issue here at hand. It's not whether or not we have this or that little, minutia to the scoring system. The deeper issue is, how do we deal to prevent power from being wielded in harmful ways? Over.
First, 1,000% agreement. We know there's no test for truth. That's a Turing machine theorem, right? There's no or Gödel theorem, and that means we have to be a bit open. Like there's clear falsehoods. I'm not a total postmodern. There's things that are absolutely false, and definitely we want to get out of the public discourse or the mainstream public discourse. And there are also, at some levels, many, if you don't think about truth, but if you think about what's a good way to live together, is there a truth there? There's probably many possible good equilibria, I hope. We haven't discovered many yet. We've discovered many bad ones, but I contend that there's many good solutions to the questions of how do we live together. And that means it's not an absolute truth. It's many conflicting possible solutions. And so there's this need for exploration and need for realizing we don't always know the truth, but we do know falsehoods. So yes, I agree. And saying truth, and as I said, the empiricism is about truth and experiment. And there I'm with you. Like what works? And autocracy, the reason autocracy is bad is that it usually doesn't last very long. And it's a waste of human potential.
I want to go back to something that Marc-Antoine brought up. One of the prominent features or misfeatures of Nazism is the practice of scapegoating. Now, scapegoating is not limited to Nazis, but that's one of the most prominent aspects of their practice. And we certainly see scapegoating, blaming the other guy for there's something haywire in the system. And instead of diagnosing what's haywire in the system, you arbitrarily pick some scapegoat, some poor scapegoat, and blame them for it. And that leads to scandalizing, which is another feature. And this practice of scapegoating and scandalizing is a very, very prominent feature of our political discourse, especially in America. I don't know how much it's a problem in other countries, but and scapegoating is an example of untruth, and scandalizing and based on scapegoating. And so if you want to get to truth, you've got to figure out how to deal with the presence of the most problematic varieties of untruth, which is scapegoating and scandalizing.
Word.
Let me just state more emphatically, because I don't think it's yet appreciated. I think that being reasonable doesn't work with brutalism. What works with power, i.e., those who can be brutal at their own choosing, has got to be some effective form of pushback. And they don't understand rational pushback. They only understand might. And that's the problem, is we find that distasteful, and that's why we lose. So until we confront that and learn to live with certain discomforts, in order to affect a better future, we are ourselves victims of our quote unquote reasonableness. And if we don't understand that, we will never level up. It's nice to sit here and say, well, you know, let's prevent violence and let's not do any of that stuff. And yet that makes plenty of room for others to execute their own violence. So until we confront that, we're doomed. Over.
Full agreement. Absolutely. The Heath book I quoted earlier has a very interesting observation, empirical study, which I'd like to have the details of, because I think it's a bit simplistic, but still saying that in a society where social norms of reciprocity are the majority, then the few people who try establishing a bubble of might is right will get sanctioned. And the sanction is what prevents them from taking over. And the problem is we've had a breakdown of believing in reciprocity, and we've had an ideology of individualism and libertarianism and anti-communitarism, and that has stopped that from working. And vice versa, in society where might is right is the dominant expression, and he really makes the point that there are societies on either end of the spectrum, and it can even be quantified, then people who establish a bubble of cooperation at first get trodden down, but if they can stay together and form community, then that bubble can expand, because the bubble has more power than pure law of the jungle. So, but that is a power struggle. And to grow the bubble of reciprocity, you have also to persuade people that it's worth doing. So yes, there's a power struggle, but I wouldn't discount the importance of reason also, because it's with reason that we can persuade others to join a community that will become large enough to have significant power. Now, of course, numbers don't, that was more true before because numbers were more of a guarantee of power. It's less true now with multiplication, like high impact weapons, where one person can cause much more damage than the numbers allow, and B, in modern surveillance society, which is why developing alternate communication networks is so important. But I still think that it's reason that will persuade people to come over to a legitimate use of power also. But yes, believing that it can all be done with reason without a power struggle, bullshit. History has shown the answer to power is a power struggle. So 1000% with your original point. And over.
Can I intervene before Sam for a second here?
Go ahead.
In terms of pushback against power, two of my heroes from the 20th century who introduced very powerful ideas on pushback against power were Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who introduced nonviolent civil disobedience as a tactic. And there aren't very many people who do that. I mean, if you can go back to Jesus and say that was an early example of nonviolent civil disobedience, but in our century, I would say, Gandhi and King are probably the two most prominent exemplars of that method of pushing back against violence.
And what happened to them?
Go ahead, Sam.
And what happened to them?
They got assassinated. They got jailed and assassinated. and they knew that was going to happen. They expected that.
Right. So let me just make one more point, and that is the bubbles of collaboration, which could potentially survive, is the source of optimism for what we're discussing here. Okay, I agree with that. I would say the best example of that today is Anonymous.
Extinction Rebellion for a little while, these kinds of, yeah, absolutely. And they're using power. On Gandhi and Martin Luther King, or at least more clearly with Martin Luther King, but I think with Gandhi as well. I think one reason they succeeded, and it's always a thing I've seen in every successful social struggle, is people proposing a nonviolent negotiated model with the very clear evidence that people were willing to die for it, and that if the demands were not accessed to, the violence would break up behind them because it was also happening at the same time. Like in many political movements, there's both a violent and a political wing. And whether, again, the movement is pro-social or anti-social, that remains true. We have both violent and political wings of most social movements. And the political wing gains power insofar as it can say, if we don't deal with us, you'll have to deal with them. And if them is if the violent wing is a violent and is a credible enough threat, then it gives credence to the political wing. That's the unfortunate fact of power.
Mark, his hand.
I wanted to, this is all great. But I wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that we are after truth, especially a truth. And what I've been promoting is the idea, and I'm going to put it on the table, and hopefully it's worthy of some comment. And that is that what we're really after is trustworthiness. That it seems to me that we were talking earlier about we welcome valid opinions. Well, if those valid opinions can be quite diverse, right? Which one is true? And the answer is, all of them may have partial truths, so it seems to me that what we're really looking for is, again, trustworthiness, where in alignment with what we were saying earlier, what we're really looking for is that the definition of trustworthy is that again, as we said earlier, I can criticize what you're saying or inspect it, tease it apart, right, and get a reaction that's open, warm, with good faith, mutual good faith, and that that opinion is supported by evidence, as we said, and the person providing their opinion is willing to provide that evidence, and willing and open, as I think most scientists are or should be, right, to criticism, right? The whole point of science and the scientific method is, here's everything I've done, here's all my work, here's all my, please tell me where I'm wrong so we can move forward. So again, it seems like it's the trustworthiness, which in my mind there's constant revisions of this as we move forward in time. Versus the notion of truth seems to me to have sort of this, and maybe it doesn't need to, but it seems to me to have this connotation of kind of locked in amber, where it's not going to. This is the truth. Everyone needs to believe it, and I think that kind of pushes people away as well.
Okay. The notion that truth must be absolute, in my opinion, is also a primitive opinion, because that's not the notion of truth behind science. It may be the truth behind mathematics if you accept the axiom as absolute, okay? But it's not the truth behind science. So what I've used as a test for truth is, does it work? If it does not work for you, or there's too many exceptions that can't get explained, then I can't put that trust that you're talking about in whatever claim or model was being stood up. Okay. And I'll give you examples where previously, let's say hundreds or thousands of years ago, we used to have heuristics about what would happen the next day. And more, as we understand phenomena, we could get more and more specific about what exactly caused those phenomena that we wanted to see. Now, none of those stages was absolutely true. Just like today, nothing is absolutely true in science. Higgs boson may be the reason why we have matter. That's our best understanding. It can't be ever represented as absolute truth, but that's okay. That's the way science works. That's the way we learn. We lean into that little gap between 6 sigma and maybe 27 sigma, okay? Whatever that turns out to be. We still need to explore that. The people that espouse absolute truth are the zealots. People that say that typically are cultish or religiosity types of fanatics. If you can say this book has the absolute truth and there's nothing to be questioned about it, that's not science. So I would prefer a way where we can improve the way we think and our models for explanation. And that's why this does it work test is a valuable test for me. And this whole notion of, hey, if it's not absolutely true, we're all free to question it. That is also sloppy thinking. We cannot allow that kind of sloppy thinking to say, oh, clearly it's not absolutely true. Therefore, my opinion is equally as valid. That's
Right.
faulty.
Yeah, we absolutely agree. My whole point is, I think there's maybe it's what people hear is, here's the truth. And they don't see it in the scientific, with the scientific mantle, which really means, like you said, this is what we know. Here's my evidence. I'm looking for you to please criticize this. So I think we're 100% in agreement. It was more of a terminology thing that
Yep.
the trust. I personally, I'm not looking. I'm looking for trust, what I call trustworthiness, and I'm putting this mantle of trustworthiness. Is the has the kinds of things we've talked about around it, right? There's evidence. I can criticize it. I can ask questions, and also that there's a history here. That there's someplace I can go to find this. I mean, part of the problem I'm having is, where do I go to find trustworthy information? There is no place that I'm aware of.
First, I agree there's a problem of terminology, as so often in human language. The word truth has very different meanings, like the very sophisticated meaning Sam just mentioned is unfortunately unknown to most people. And we can choose to try to explain to them what scientific truth means and how it's not the same as religious truth, and versus the trying to get more to get another term, like trustworthiness. What I do like, I've been actually pushing back on Martin about trustworthiness, but I actually like the term in some ways because it's clear that trustworthiness is, well, unfortunately, it looks like it's an attribute of the person, and that's absolutely not what I would like to convey. But it's clearly not an attribute of the information. It's an attribute of the epistemic process. The question is, if you have many reasons, many conflicting reasons to believe different things, what makes a reason a good reason? That's the real question I would want people to learn to ask. For me, the goal of making it a game is to getting people into the habit of questioning. Why do I think this is valid evidence? Why do I think that this value criterion is more important than that value criterion? And asking themselves, like when I say, you know, I think it's better to have diversity than not. Some people believe the opposite. It's an opinion. Some people want a very want to live in a monoculture. Why do I say that diversity is a good thing? Well, that's an argument to have. It's a meta argument to have, and I really want people to start thinking meta, and that way, it's a process, and it's not what is decided through the process that's trustworthy. It's the trust that people are using that process as honestly as they can. Because there's also scientific fraud, right? But the overall science tends towards eliminating falsehoods because even though there are flawed scientists, the institution as a whole tends to eliminate the most egregious deviations from the process. Sometimes it takes time. Over.
Again, if I may refocus, I love this discussion of truth and eventual transparency. That's something I wanted to introduce. It's not strictly transparency, but eventual transparency to this conversation. But to even pull back further, how do we then deal with those to whom truth is not that important, or indeed is to be vilified? We have to figure out, if we want to level up, I keep saying, how to confront power. Now, some people have posed that those who control and gain and acquire and try to hang on to power are vulnerable to mockery. I think that's a weak argument. But sometimes it works. And certainly with those who are, let's say, low EQ, who hang on to power, it sometimes works effectively. But in general, I don't think it's enough. So I think we need another way.
I'll say one thing about that. I agree, still full agreement. One thing I want to do, and if I manage to get to there before I die, is create good processes for not so much truth finding, but though that's part of it, sense making, certainly, but also transparent governance, transparent collective governance process, so that people may try it in small organizations at first and hopefully bigger ones eventually, but people get used to the idea that it's possible to discuss reasons for whatever rule you want to self-impose in a collective, and that it is possible to expect a full explanation and a full conversation, and that it's not necessarily paralyzing, as many people have had the experience of collective decision making as paralyzing. But if we can improve those mechanisms, people can learn that it's possible and hence demand it on the political scale. This is a very reasonable approach, but I think it's also harder to answer people who want autocracy unless you can show that non-autocracy works well. And, I'm Canadian. We used to have a pretty functional government. Thank you very much. Uh, the, the Americans have been fed on, government cannot work because it's been sabotaged for decades. And so many people now believe government cannot work. I had a working government in my youth. I'm not saying it was perfect, I'm not saying it was flawless, but I'm saying it was overall functional. So I don't share this idea that democracy is inherently flawed. uh, I think that's very much an American disease, US disease. But on the other hand, can it be improved? Oh my God, yes. Again, I don't believe representative democracy is the best way to do things. Deliberative democracy is what I'm aiming for. But nobody believes that's possible. We have to show it is. Over. And and by the way, I'm not saying that's the only thing to do. It's what I choose to do.
Yeah, I concur with what Marc-Antoine is saying. But back to the mockery as a weapon, I think that's right. It is a weapon. It's not the only one. It's not 100% effective. Certainly, I'm not even, don't want to argue about what percentage. It seems to me that the primary weapon is sunlight, as I think I've heard it called. And what I've noticed is that there are certain people who want to use the scientific method, and we've been discussing this, right? There are certain people who want to know, well, what do you believe in and why? That's interesting. Why do you say that? I mean, there's some people who tell me what to think, and there's some people who ask me those kinds of questions, and I think that's really what we're trying to get at here. And again, what I've noticed is that certainly on the larger stage, the people there are. I'll just say it this way. One of the reasons I believe or not believe people is because how like we've said, how what is the evidence? No matter what you say, there's a lot of confusion, I think, between evidence and assertion, right? So there's a lot of assertion going on, and yet when they when people go to the courtroom or when it's actually analyzed, let me just say there's some groups who absolutely try to avoid any kind of analysis of what they believe, where they're going, why they believe it, et cetera. So for me, the trustworthiness is, and I know I'm being repetitive, is this whole fairly simple, straightforward process of, what is your perspective? What claims are you making? How open are you to questions and to criticism? The fact that we have to use mockery, is, I think, a response to the lack of openness, which is its own measure. So for me, it all comes back to, yeah, how can we? And it seems to me it's related to where do I, as a concerned citizen, go for trustworthy information on any topic. And again, for me, trustworthy simply means, why do you believe, what is your opinion on some topic and why do you believe that? And if people aren't willing to put this information in a public forum, then why should I believe you? And this is what I mean by the sunshine, right? So that it seems to me that people who do agree with our philosophy, because I think I'm hearing this as a mutual philosophy of openness, of evidence, of good faith, would be willing to, put their understanding in a public forum, and defend it, or I mean, whatever. I mean, have that dialogue that we've all been talking about, et cetera. And then there's a set of people who I think will not, and that's its own indicator. And I think that's what I mean by the sunlight is. I think we have to try to force, and I mean force by, hey, why is your opinion not out here? Why is your evidence not out here? Right? Why are you not open to criticism? So the fact they're not there is, I think, why I'm certainly working with Jack and Mark and stuff.
The one protocol that's present in the scientific method, but generally absent in other forums, like political forums, is somebody asserts an opinion or belief or a hypothesis or notion. In science, you want to say, how did you conclusively rule out, falsify all the alternative hypotheses? In science, you have to show that you have falsified the competing hypothesis. In ordinary discourse, that's not used. It's an omitted protocol that ought to be present.
Yeah. Of course, not all the competing hypotheses, but all the known competing hypotheses.
Exactly. And that's the problem is that you can have essentially an uncountable number of alternative hypotheses, including idiotic ones, and the effort to falsify them all is an infinite effort. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, that point was made by Persig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But yes, I think that at least, even known is maybe too much, but let's say the prominent competing methods, until something new becomes prominent, but that's fair enough. But that's why we have to reevaluate evidence periodically, and that's also part of the science protocol.
But isn't that part of the crowdsourcing? To say, hey, here's our perspective, here's why, here's the evidence, here's what we think we know about the competing claims. I mean, and to articulate them, I think provides some or increases some amount of the trustworthiness, and to be open to please, as you said, I can't possibly know everything. There's too much. So please bring it. That's the point. Bring it. We want. This is why it needs to be crowdsourced. I don't think it can
Absolutely.
From a small group of know-it-alls, so to speak. So yeah, bring the other perspectives, bring other evidence, et cetera, so that we can work on it together.
Okay.
Over.
Quickly, we are probably many here with the training in natural science more than social science. There's unfortunately very little disproof in social science, and competing hypotheses can keep fighting it out forever, including some clearly disproven one, and that's a problem, but including some valid multiple perspectives. Or I've long said, I think in social settings, people act for usually a combination of reasons coming together. And that means if you try to isolate an explanatory factor, it will probably be one of the factors that led to someone's action, but that doesn't mean that somebody analyzing it through the grid of another factor is wrong, because probably all of these had to come together to motivate someone to take an action. So any single factor explanation is both partial and as such wrong, and also contributing and real. And the real multi-factor explanation is too complex to analyze in practically. This is where the notion of truth is much more complicated. Still, I do believe there is value in social science. I'm not among those who say, oh, they can't mathematize it, so it's hogwash. I think there is real value in trying to understand things, and there is actual progress in saying, this explanation doesn't fit the facts, not even partially. But we have to think much more carefully. Like they have to develop different protocols, and I think we should be very attentive to that, because most of our concerns are with social choices, and those are much more social phenomena than natural science phenomena. So some of the paradigms of proof we bring over from natural science are not directly applicable. That's what I wanted to say. Yes.
So at the risk of being pedantic and trite, I want to answer Martin's question about why don't they come to the table. And my trite answer is because they don't have to, because they already hold the power. Okay. But the thing I really wanted to intervene with is, for quite a long time, Heiner has actually been here. I'm not sure each of you has met Heiner. Heiner goes way back and has attended all of the COP meetings that have been held ever since I encountered Heiner. He's in Berlin, Germany. He was part of the Club of Berlin, Club of Rome. Anyway, he knows a lot of the early players, and he's a fount of much history and research in climate change and all of its attendant issues. And I was wondering, Heiner, if you're still there listening. You may not be, but if you are, I would really like for you to at least introduce yourself, show yourself perhaps. If you're not there, this will be, I guess, this. But just wanted to make sure that Heiner got some recognition that he's been at this for 4 or 5, maybe more decades, just like Barry has, and some of you. But I wanted to make sure that Heiner had an opportunity to participate. Heiner, are you there? Perhaps not. Okay. This is actually because he's in Berlin. Starts at around 5 p.m. his time, and so it's probably close to 6:30 or 7 p.m. his time already. And typically, when he comes, he participates for the first half hour, and then just goes into listening mode. So that might have been what happened today. So hopefully, you guys have a chance in a future session to meet Heiner. Also wanted to say Stacy is one of our longtime participants. Josh, who just dropped off, is one of our longtime participants. We sometimes get another woman from Southern California, Kayla. And so those are some of the regulars that, oh, and then there's Eric Rangel from Nova Scotia, I believe. Is that where he is? Some of you may know him.
Pennsylvania, I think.
Pennsylvania? Okay.
Delaware. He's from Delaware.
Delaware.
Oh, he's from Delaware. Okay, so yeah, I misplaced those people because East Coast to me is this one little location right over to the right. I'm just kidding. Stacy, what have you made of all of this so far?
You know what? I'm really sick, so I'm just listening. I'm very sick.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to give you an opportunity, but
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Hope you feel better soon.
Yeah.
Hope so too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, it's been
Anyway.
some time. Best of luck. Stacy knows us. We meet in other venues, so she's heard a lot of this before, I think. Sorry, we've kind of invaded your space and numbers, and it's
Vitamin D and zinc, Stacy.
Yes, I've been told that. I can't even get up to get it though.
Well,
But
start taking it regularly.
okay. Thank
Shall
you.
we send an Amazon drone? Anyway,
Yes.
no, I don't consider this an invasion. I think this is an opportune convergence of a couple of communities, hopefully, who will then enrich each other. And I think this is hopefully not the last of these conversations. I hope there'll be continuing participation both ways.
And just so you know, Marc-Antoine, that's even though I'm feeling this way because I knew you were coming. That's why I'm here. So it's not an invasion at all. It's a treat.
Thank you, Stacy. That's flattering. Hopefully you heard some new stuff. I mean, some of this I feel I've been repeating over and over in so many venues, but hopefully you got some new stuff. I went a bit deeper into Heath today, and I'm happy I did.
Yeah.
Jack, you want to pipe up and say something?
Something. No, I'm fundamentally in listening mode today. Um, I somewhat exhausted myself yesterday. Um, and I really wanted Marc-Antoine and Martin to have enough daylight to really engage with you folks because I see powerful linkages and I think Sam saw them. They need to evolve.
Yeah. Let me riff on that. I think that since the first small string that sort of piqued people's interest was the thing of scoring systems, right? So let me go back to that thing because getting social engagement, I think, is crucial for a number of reasons if we believe in uh, social benefit. But I think what's more interesting is what we've been doing here, which is how do you evaluate that? How do you inspire that? How do you encourage that? How do you get that to provide positive value in some kind of optimal or maximal way? Which I think is what the scoring system was intended to do. But I saw some ways to sort of enrich that scoring system because it affects behavior so strongly. And I wanted that set of possible scoring systems to be itself the subject of quests, multiple quests, so that we could all learn what works better, what doesn't work, and that we could then say, oh, well, for this one, let's try that over there that Marc-Antoine proposed. And for this one, let's try berries, or this one, let's try jacks. And sort of say, okay, well, these two worked well together, but that introduced this other possibility that didn't work. And sort of be able to play around with those refinements so that we could, as a community or a community of communities, learn what works. That to me was the interesting aspect of this. Not so much that, oh, we just have to have a scoring mechanism because we want people to participate and they'll get points. And that to me was anathema. If we could actually get the rich form that we're discussing here and that we've been discussing the last couple of weeks, then I think we're onto something. Okay, so that's my interest in trying to get these ideas laid on the table. Thank you.
So I wanted to just riff on that a little bit. When Martin Radley and I started Topic Quests, my thesis at the time was that if we just move people into guilds, they'll learn how to behave. Um, and I credit Marc-Antoine with coming back with the fact that the scoring mechanism was a huge part of that. I was comfortable with the usual dopamine response, um, competitive leaderboard in the guild space in the but Marc-Antoine is the guy that added that whole new dimension to this, and now Sam has come in and started hammering on it. So I really think that we're orbiting some kind of a pay dirt, a place that's truly crucial to the future of humankind. Over.
I'm slightly tempted to show you what we have or what we've planned, and I think I need to study what Barry's doing because I do think it's extremely relevant. The aspect of emotions and I still I stand with my question: how do we get the people macro and micro behaviors are distantly connected. And how do we get people to understand these connections? Some of that will be empiricism, as we said. But when you spoke of functions, I said those are macro functions, not micro level functions. And that's really a question I still have. But what I've been trying to do, and let me share screen 2 seconds, is this didn't even go into presenter mode. I hope it's legible. I could go in presenter mode, I guess. View slideshow. Yes, you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, this was about goals. This is a presentation we did. Unfortunately, that presentation the record was never put on. I'm so annoyed. But what are we trying to optimize for? Deep listening and nuance versus reactivity. These are the kind of, what are the goals of, what is the goal trying to promote through the various indicators? And then think about what indicators might help distinguish these behaviors. So deep listening and nuance is one thing. Reward exhausting mapping, I'm a strong believer in structured conversation. And I think it's very interesting to have people start with narrative positions and have everybody try to decompose one another's position into structured elements, presuppositions, hypotheses, expectations, whatever, because then it allows to clear up misunderstandings, and the elements may be then compared and recombined in a way that you go deeper in mutual understanding. The exercise of having to decode what the other is saying is a way to encourage deep listening. So when I say reward exhaustive mapping, I do mean with points, but it's not because I think that I don't see it as a rule. It's for me, this is very much a protocol design. Let's people, as a protocol, try to deeply understand what the other is saying. And yes, let's use points in a game as a way to indicate, yes, you did as expected. Is that working? Does that really encourage deep listening or just a semblance of it? Well, that is something to be determined. But I'm very much thinking about, again, mutual systems, such as if many teams map one other team's narrative, and one of the team identifies an element that is really there, but that no other team identified, that's more valuable. That's the kind of things where it's more about rewarding exhaustivity that way. Encourage clarification questions, and then be explicit about, oh, do you mean this or that? And ask those questions. I'm not sure about this. And verify plausibility of alternatives with the other teams. Again, who read it that way? Competition versus purely adversarial dynamic. And this is where I came up with neutral scoring. So for example, at each turn in a turn-based system, each team have to spend a token to identify the most significant argument from another team. So that's a way to say there's no absolute truth, but what made you think the most? And this is, again, very much inspired by Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Sometimes we can't name quality, but we can still recognize it. This is what I was trying to leverage here. And reward synthesis. If somebody says, oh, we could do this, oh, but there's those issues. Oh, what about taking those elements, recombine, and does it bridge? Does it answer some of the arguments that were put against either option, and so on? Track adoption of proposal and synthesis by teams favor change. If people were opposed to either, but they're more favorable to the synthesis, that means that the synthesis accomplished a real synthesis as opposed to just a hodgepodge of options. Design for epistemic curiosity. Of course, external evidence is the minimal justification. That was something Jack wanted from the start, but can you show that you understand it? Can you there's often contradictory evidence. What do we do with that? And this is where it gets really interesting and getting into meta reflection. Why is this piece of evidence more convincing than that one? What were the methodological limits, for example, of that piece of evidence? Or what are the shared epistemic heuristics to determine the quality of evidence, or axiologic heuristics like value systems? Why is this value more important than that value? And again, like, have that conversation. There's and when I say patterns, I speak of patterns versus protocols. It's because I think it is valuable to ask people, can you spot the pattern? And the pattern can be many things. It can be the argumentation scheme, classic rhetoric, find the trope, find the fallacy is how it was presented, but most fallacies are actually heuristics. And heuristics are valid in some cases and valid in some other cases. There are critical questions for each so-called fallacy. In understanding what are the strengths and weakness, it's like the forces of the patterns. What are the forces that make this particular heuristic more or less likely to be accurate in this particular case? And really the deep democracy question of why is that important to you? Why is that important to you? Why? And the 5 whys type of rules. And we said that's an old presentation almost, but it's gone a bit beyond that. But co-design was very clearly a meta goal. And I say players define quality, but co-design game dynamics. Players design their own team dynamics right now, but what pro-social behaviors should the game encourage? I've listed 3. There could be more, and construct a grammar and presentation of meta reasoning, and have the players negotiate patterns that they see as positive behaviors that encourage positive results. And again, identifying them explicitly as part of game design. And so this is what's there. Sam added something about maybe examining the discrepancy between agreed to behavior and effective behavior during play. That's really interesting. And then we get into, okay, what possible scoring systems could do that? Yes, Sam, before I go on. Sorry, I was rambling.
Just a quick thought flashed as you were on the previous page. And that is, you had guilds coming up with their own pro-social behaviors or their own team dynamics. I think it's part of the scalability that you seem to be working towards. Guilds eventually emerge from their own guild and present something and then interact with other guilds. So if each is behaving according to their own team dynamics, that event is interesting because then that guild is presenting something and is, I think, expecting feedback from other guilds and other entities. And at that point, then the differences in dynamics would come into play. So the things that one team, let's say the producer team, the systems that they have internal to their team that define their optimal engagement cannot be assumed to apply once you publish this thing and others start to engage with it. And that's another reason why I'm interested in this co-creation of game dynamics is eventually that is going to happen as teams emerge and send things out from their closed space. Over.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Jack has long argued, and I totally agree. Eventually, this should be a gold mine for social scientists trying to understand and I mean, we all keep saying it has to be empirical. Well, let's have this is a model. It's a simplified model of social interaction and epistemic social interaction, and let's see what goal dynamics are. What team dynamics and game dynamics and set of incentives are productive to have deep understanding and deep solutions, or deep understanding. Let's start with that, but hopefully deep solutions as well. Now let's go back to actual proposed scoring mechanisms. Like right now, the draft 0 was points for supported arguments and proposals. That is, if you have an argument and you have a reference for it, that gives you points. If it's contradicted by a supported argument, then it gets negated. If a proposal is supported by arguments supported by references, it's good, unless again it's attacked. That's a kind of truth seeking, which I see as totally suboptimal. So the question is how to reward various things. Originality is good. The some of the text is a bit obscure. Sorry, I'm sometimes thinking aloud in those documents, but distribute, like if many people come up with a similar solution, you want to say, and you don't want to say whoever got it first. I think that's ridiculous. If they each came to it within the same turn, I don't care who got it first. I don't want to encourage speed. I want to encourage depth. And that way saying, oh, 2 of the 5 teams found it, well, the points for that solution get distributed between whoever had it. So a more original solution just gets more points because it's more original. Now, of course, it may be a bad solution, then it gets less points. And bad, again, other ways to measure that. Neutral scoring, I've spoken about that enough. Tokens, points for proposal improvement. If somebody proposes a solution, somebody proposes an improvement, and there's consensus that the improvement has value. That is, for example, there was an argument, a counter argument to the original that doesn't apply to the improved version, then you get points, but also the original proposer gets points because it was part of the scaffolding. Points for synthesis, I've spoken about that. Points for structure reformulation, that is going from narrative to structured, I spoke about that. Identifying hidden assumptions, obvious enough. Identifying patterns, and that's what I said, like, let's identify, for example, the heuristic and its strengths and weaknesses, or that's one level, but there's patterns at many layers, and it's really interesting to look at patterns at many layers. For example, the metaphorical frames that Lakoff keeps speaking about. Oh, this is leaning on this metaphorical frame. Could we apply a different frame? Being able to spot that, I think, is worth something. And I really want points for mastery. I really understand how this pattern, how to detect it, how to identify it, and how to learn from it. I think that's really important. And points for going meta, like bringing the conversation to the higher level and say, why is this a good criterion? Why do we care about this criterion? Why do we think this is valid? Why do we think that this presents valid evidence? And yeah, that's kind of, this is never going to be a complete list, but this is what I have so far as mechanisms to reward what I see as positive qualities: deep listening, competition, epistemic curiosity, and meta. Yeah.
It sounds a little bit like something that the Nobel Prize was awarded, I think, about 20 years ago to 3 economists who were working on a branch of game theory, and they coined the term mechanism design. Now, if you haven't heard of it, mechanism design is a model that if you choose a strategy that may be beneficial in the short term but detrimental in the long term, the mechanism design, a suboptimal strategy in the long term, is also suboptimal in the short term, so that you get an immediate. So you're always at a disadvantage by doing the unethical thing right now as opposed to later. And so the Nobel Prize went to these 3 economists who came up with this concept of mechanism design, where there's no advantage to cheating or doing something selfishly because it hurts you right away, not just later.
That is something I'm aware of, but need to study in more depth. But what you're saying is you seem to recognize virtues of that there. That's definitely something I need to study even more urgently. I am curious too. But
Yeah, look up mechanism design and economics Nobel Prize about 20 years ago, and then you could
No,
probably,
no, I'm aware of the
yeah.
prize, but I still need to read that deeply, so I will. Thanks. It wasn't obvious for me how to apply what little I knew, so I will look deeper. If you have clearer applications, I'm already curious.
Yeah,
Let me put it this way.
I was intrigued by the fact of the Nobel Prize. Reducing it to practice may be trickier than one might desire. I don't know. But the
In early
notion is that
cases,
it's mathematically possible according to their work.
right. Sam?
So a Gedanken experiment. Let's suppose that this conversation took place in the scoring system that you have in place. Okay. I'm
Yep.
curious to see how each of us, as we participated, would have been scored.
Very good. Yeah.
And then as a scenario B, once we have had this conversation, let's assume that this conversation has concluded and it's taken place, and all of us are taking away what we understood about it. And you had a chance to then take a look at refining the scoring system if you chose to do so. I'm then saying, okay, suppose we take the same conversation and look at it in terms of scoring system B. And contrast A and B. And you could then say, how would every person's participation, I assume, be scored differently? And what would that have encouraged? And what would that mean for future conversations? So it's not something that I'm asking you to do now because it's difficult, but I'm just saying as a what if. That's the kind of metacognition that I would try to stimulate here. Over.
No, I absolutely agree. To the first question, I cannot answer because we're not yet playing by the protocol in the sense that I think we're having a very honest conversation. I'm really happy with how everybody's been, listening to one another and questioning, but not attacking. I think it's been so far a good dynamic. One thing I do expect from the game dynamics is to make it a bit more formal, to say, okay, you've said this. What this means concretely is you're claiming this, or you're claiming that this is a solution, or this is a criterion, and this blah, 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 blah. And then people could go on and say, well, that's not exactly what I thought I was saying, and precise, and then have an equilibrium of iterated positions. And then we could see whose contribution was the most generative for everybody. I mean, in the ideal trusted situation, without the competitive aspect of the game, we would each say, how do I feel about this at the beginning, honestly, maybe dubious, maybe enthusiastic, blah, blah, blah. And then by looking at shifts in positions, I'm not sure there were many shifts in position here, but looking at shifts in position, we could see what were the most thought-provoking statements. That's one aspect. And also, I could say, oh, this is something I came up with now because your intervention made me think about this. I don't know if that happened a lot because we each were kind of reacting with things we knew. I suspect, I get the impression. But I think we were open to listening to one another, which should be good. So these are all qualities which I think should be recognized. On the other hand, in a game, competitive game situation, we'd expect people to not necessarily be honest about their beliefs. Jack often quotes how people lie about what they believe in the Oxford debate to score points by pretending to shift their mind. And this is why I think it's really interesting to go in the turn system, have everybody deposit things, and then it becomes public at the end of turn. And then we can see, okay, what was really new to people here because they didn't put it down before. Again, that's instead of honesty in a game context. In society, that's not the behavior we want to encourage. But on the other hand, being explicit about the most things is also part of what I want to encourage. And one thing that's really important for me also to encourage in this game, maybe it's not in my list and should be, is refining vague proposals into precise proposals. Like, epistemic curiosity is good as a vague proposal. Let me measure epistemic curiosity with this metric is precise. And that's really important. Like, we can all agree on the generalities, but when it's the devil's always in the detail. And driving one another to say, okay, what does it mean concretely? Like what does thinking in functions mean concretely for people thinking about improving their own behavior? That's my question. I don't know yet, and I think it's a great question to ask. I'm not just doing it to Eggberry. I think it's fantastic to think about that because it's a real question. Let's be clear, but it is a question. I don't know what it means yet, concretely. I think I know what it means abstractly. And that's part of and in some cases we've been precise, and in some cases we have work to do. And all these scores, it's what do we think is important? I think it's important to be precise because that's how you get disprovability in Popperian terms. I think it's important to be open because that's how you benefit from requisite variety. Those are values. Do we agree on values? I suspect we do mostly. We certainly value truth over power. That's important. Or at least some more elaborate version of truth, not just absolute truth. Or trustworthiness, as Martin puts it. And we value process over the result, and I think that's also something we share. How do we instill both the practice and the value of that? For me, that's the point of the game. Over.
May I?
Yes.
Part of the reason for asking the question the way I did is that for matters that really stretch the dimensions of the discussion space, that initial orthogonality is not going to be easily understood. Now, if at the conclusion of a meeting, I was either assigned a point or not a point based on that, that kind of eliminates the longer term impact, the long tail of that possible contribution. Many contributions need multiple impressions. People in marketing know this, okay? So it wasn't the case that immediately upon saying, hey, we're not heliocentric, bam, the guy was put on stake, okay? No, it took some time, okay, for the implications of that statement to unfurl. So over time, these statements are understood to have some import if they really do add that new dimension to the discussion, and then the implications get fleshed out, and secondary, third, tertiary, et cetera, implications get fleshed out. Then it has long-term impact, which is lost when 2 hours after the meeting starts, I either get a point or not a point. And that's the long-term value that I think is lost in point-based immediate scoring systems. Over.
Full agreement on that. Immediate scoring is flawed. One thing Jack has said is maybe your argument that you've made in this game will be transcluded in another game because somebody finds value in it and will gain, belated credit in later. And that's really important. It's a point, and it's a real question. You make a point early on in a game or in a conversation, nobody gets it. And then it turns out much later in the conversation, oh, that's what you meant. Yes, that was important. We all missed it. Now, on the one hand, it's too bad they missed it. And I don't want to say shame on you because maybe you weren't ready for whatever reason. It happens. But is it, there's bravo for the initial statement because it said something that was later recognized to be important. But on the other hand, maybe could you have expressed it differently so its import was recognized at the beginning? Maybe not. And of course, it's a conversation. So there's going to be bandwidth and there's going to be things that are neglected at first, even no matter how well expressed, that will later be recognized to be significant. It's obvious to me that the whatever points you give immediately during the course of the game should pale towards versus things that are recognized later. And this is why I'm like giving points at the end of one conversation. We'll really understand the value of contributions after an iterated game. And that's my problem with crowdsourcing, right? People who confuse collective intelligence with crowdsourcing depress me because crowdsourcing only gets you the best idea anybody had before the conversation happened, which is not the same as collective intelligence. Collective intelligence is when people iterate and improve in a group. And you don't get that with crowdsourcing.
May I respond to that one? There are certain notions which, by their very strangeness, may not be easily comprehended. So if you're saying, hey, I could have expressed it better, yeah, maybe. But also, maybe the recipients should have been, quote unquote, more open-minded. Okay? This gets to the point about idiocy. Some people just cannot understand syllogisms. And I'm, pointing to like 49% of the US population. Okay. So is it my fault that they cannot understand syllogisms? And should I therefore get a demerit simply because I didn't get the point across to them? Again,
Yeah.
I know this sounds trite and it sounds obvious, but this is why a simple point-based system is, in my view, simplistic. And if I'm going to be awarded or penalized a point based on whether or not something caught hold, then the recipients ought to be evaluated in whether or not they actually could comprehend a simple syllogism or a set of evidence or, some theory in game theory. Okay.
Absolutely.
And if they cannot, then, I'm talking in a vacuum at that point. Why should I be scored in a vacuum?
Now,
sorry, just one more point, okay? And this gets back to what I call, what is it? This mentor, mentor notion, okay? Which is, if I were to make a point, I would make it differently to Jack than I would make it to my 20-year-old daughter, than I would make to a 5-year-old, than I would make to Doug Engelbart, okay? Same point, but I would express it differently. And in a context where I don't actually know the audience, or the audience has no responsibility to comprehend what I'm saying, and the evaluation is just on my utterance, then that's only, something that captures part of what I was trying to do. Where I could be trying to express it to that particular audience, X, Y, Z over there. But if you're evaluating me based on whether or not it's a Wikipedia worthy article, that's a different criterion. So that's why I'm saying, I'm just introducing these dimensions of scoring systems that affect behavior, that affect engagement, and encourage or discourage participation and engagement. Over.
No, point well taken, and I totally agree. And that's one reason I think the badges for mastery of certain patterns are extremely important. If you don't understand a pattern, well, you're playing the game to learn it. And if you don't learn it, well, there's a limitation on how much your judgment is worth in terms of judging the other person's. On the other hand, and I know it's a problem for me, I tend to make very complex arguments because I have a kind of, on the one hand, on the other hand, description of many things. Like, I just started this thing about if this thing was misunderstood, whose fault is it? It's on both sides. I start with nuance, and a lot of people don't get me because of that. And it is, in the one hand, a weakness of mine that I'm not able to explain nuance well enough, and I need to work on that. On the other hand, it's also a weakness of people having a lot of trouble understanding, on the one hand, on the other hand, nuanced opinions. People want black and white. But for me, this is both a reality and hopefully something we can change. It's not about people are incapable of understanding a syllogism, is they've never, maybe some of them are too stupid, quite probably, but I'm sure quite a few just never have been put in a situation where they had any benefit to understand it. And that's also the point of the game. Yeah, we have to let go. Let's put people in a situation where they're confronted with more nuanced arguments and they have to learn to listen better. And they will be judged on their ability to understand some more complex stuff. Yes. That's part of the judgment. And yes, audience matters, of course. I'm a big fan of one thing that dear Mike Caulfield has said is choral explanations. Anything should be explained in many ways because different audiences will understand different similes or different or have different starting points. And I think these explanations need to coexist. There's never one. What?
Sorry. Well, I'll let you finish.
No. It's just it's. There's never going to be one explanation of a point. Go on. Over.
There are a very good series of videos on YouTube these days where an expert explains a phenomenon to 3 or 4 different stakeholder types.
Age groups.
There's
Age
one
groups.
that does zero trust proofs, for example. It explains it to a 5-year-old, to a college student, to a PhD, to very expert collaborator. And they will, of course, use a different expression and terms. It's a very fascinating set of videos because it's not one channel that does this, but it's a kind of new form of presentation where somebody says, let me just take these 4 different stakeholder types or individuals and explain a very complex mechanism like zero trust proof, okay, to these different individuals. So I think if you look for, I don't even know what the word is that captures it, but if you just look for zero trust proof, you'll find that video and then you'll figure out which one.
I'm familiar with the series, with one of the series that does this. It's a great system, absolutely.
Yeah. And I do apologize. I do have to drop off for a session at .30. We still have 20 minutes, but I was hoping that people would be able to at least wrap up in a sense. We're not going to resolve all this, obviously, in a single session. Barry and I have been going at this for years. But I'm glad that this took place. I'm glad that each of you, I think, were here today and participated to the degree you were comfortable. I would suggest that if you go back and review some of the past sessions with Barry and Josh and Stacy and others, we definitely get to points where we are uncomfortable or perhaps introduce discomfort simply because we're pushing each other's boundaries on some of these points. I don't think in an introductory meeting like this that will happen. I didn't expect it to. But Barry and I certainly had our moments about certain of these discussion points. And I know Barry enjoys it just as much as I do, if not more. Any wrap-up thoughts from any of you, particularly the silent ones? Heiner, one last call. Are you there? I'll take it as a no.
Is it always 2 hours and a half?
Well,
no, it's usually 2 hours. Okay. And then sometimes maybe 2 people linger on, after everybody else leaves. But we find that 2 hours is about the limit of where some of these things can be productive before we sort of lose steam and have other things to do and family asks where we are, et cetera, et cetera.
I'll share.
Jack.
a thought that occurred to me during this conversation. So I credit the banter with evoking this highly nonlinear thought. It occurred to me that the Dunbar number should apply to guilds as well. Now, I don't mean internal to guilds. We already solved that problem. But how many guilds can you compete with in a conversation? And if Dunbar originally said 150 and later brought it down to around a half a dozen, then I came up with the concept of hierarchical games. That is to say, the Federation spawns multiple instances of a given quest and assigns 6 guilds, just to pick a number, to each quest. And then the Federation does the merging of the final trees as they are growing. And the final tree is visible to all players. And that is that's a to me a novel architectural thought that I need to put in our AnyType and start thinking about. Over.
Quick reaction. I just put in the chat sociocratic model. You're probably familiar, the notion that there's many groups of 10 and then 10 groups of 10. Each group of 10 chooses one representative to the next higher level group of 10 and so on, which has its pros and cons. My preferred vision is the pollinators in World Cafe or open space. The notion that but really World Cafe, like let's have somebody recombine ideas from one group to the other. I don't know what's the good. What is clear is that having many people work on the quest in parallel is a great way to have cross-pollination and introduce more diversity at critical moments. And many successful conversation techniques that have been tried insist on the alternates of divergent and convergent thinking. I think there's also a kind of good tempo for introducing novel ideas in a conversations. And I don't know what that is yet. We'll want to be empirical about that. Over.
At the risk of introducing something new and extending this conversation, maybe I should shut up and save it for next time.
No, I see. I read your comment. I want to. One of the first forays I did in collective intelligence, I was working with somebody who had a lot of very practical, concrete experience at guiding conversation on listservs. And he introduced 2 ideas to me, which I found extremely interesting. One of them was in any group, you'll have usually 1% of ultra active people, 10% of occasionally active people, and 90% of spectators. And if you decide to, oh, let's forget the spectators, let's just focus on the active, at least somewhat active people, you kind of find the same proportion reproduced in the smaller nucleus. He said this proportion is kind of an empirical rule of conversations because up to a point, the spectators are part of the audience that motivates the active people to talk, but also there's a kind of natural power law that seems to happen. So that's on the mathematic angle of this, which I found quite fascinating. But the other thing he said is in conversations he was involved in, there would be this dynamic. His practice was to let the conversation happen for a while, and at the moment where there was a point of stillness, inject a synthesis Like, this is what everybody said, outline, point form. And that would allow people who didn't really have the time to read the whole conversation to get the overview and say, you know what, I'm not sure about this. And then somebody would say something, and then that would restart the conversation until it reached another equilibrium, and he would repeat the processes. And he said very often, from one outline synthesis to the next, there would be a Copernican revolution in the classification of ideas or new ideas appearing that totally upended the conversation. Now, I think that happened a few times, and he was a bit optimistic in generalizing this, but still, it's something that did happen. But the whole thing of giving a TLDR of the variety to everybody was a way to get everybody's attention so an occasional contributor could chime in. Very interesting dynamic. That was the basis for the design of Assemble Idealoom. It was about making it easier to create these synthesis aspects. And there is definitely something there about the dynamic of information transfer. Like in IBIS, the original IBIS, having somebody external to the conversation doing the mapping was essential. Here it was somebody doing the synthesis, and they don't have to get it right. I mean, as long as people can say, hey, you got that wrong, and please correct it. But the effort of creating an external synthesis focuses the attention outwards from the conversation dynamic to more the ideas, and allows refocusing on, by the way, there's this thing we just let go in the conversation, and it's really important. We need to pay attention to that. So these are, I don't know if these are rules, but these are certainly dynamic patterns. And it's really important to pay attention to those. Over.
With regard to the Dunbar numbers, if you're going to discuss something at a given level of abstraction, say the most concrete level, then you need essentially 6 participants, one to ask each of the basic questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. So you have to have 6 participants. Could be 2 people can do the same role, but generally the notion is there are 6 questions asked at any given level. Then if you want to do more than one level of abstraction, say concrete and 1 or 2 meta levels above that, then you need to have 12 for one to have a combination of concrete and 1 meta level, 18 if you want to have 2 meta levels, and if you want to go all the way from the most concrete to the most abstract, which is 6 levels of abstraction, that's 36. And that's a Kabbalistic notion of the so-called Lamed Vav. Lamed Vav is how you say 36 in Hebrew numbering. And the Lamed Vav says you need 36 righteous people in a conversation to reach all of the great insights from the most concrete to the most abstract. And that's one way of looking at the Dunbar numbers. Minimum of 6, the maximum of 36. Where each person is responsible for exactly one question at one meta level, one level of abstraction.
I don't know if the 6 questions speak to me, but that's okay. It's a pattern. We'll have to play with
you
patterns.
can only ask who, what, where, when, why, and how. That's the only ways you can begin to question. So the 6 ways.
Okay, I'm going to let you guys continue. Okay. I'm going to unfortunately have to drop off. I will get the recording posted. By the way, I hope you guys all saw yesterday's recording was posted around 4 a.m. this morning. So I don't know if any of you have caught that already. Jack, I think I sent you the URL. You can share it with the rest of the team if you like.
Please.
Didn't take that liberty to do so immediately. Okay. But yeah, if you look, Jack and I and Barry were on for the whole 2 hours yesterday. I don't know if you could get a lot out of that, but that was definitely a precursor to this particular conversation. Okay. And I do have to go join someone else in about 8 minutes. So I'll let you guys continue as long as you guys like, but I am saying goodbye for now. Okay. Thank you.
I must go also. Good
I think
conversation. Thank you.
it's a good breaking point. I'll think about other questions. Ciao, ciao.
Think about any question at any level of abstraction, from the most concrete to the most abstract.
I'll think about this.
Okay.
I don't.
Bye.
It's an old
Bye.
idea. It's a Kabbalistic idea called the Lamed Vav, which is how you say 36.
It's interesting. It's interesting.
Barry,
Enjoy.
Barry, stay
Bye.
on for 1 second.
Okay.
First of all, I love that about the I totally resonate with that. But I just want to ask you, did you ever hear of a book called by a woman named, now I gotta think of her name, Florence Schindler? The book is called The Game of Life and How to Play It from 1925.
That doesn't ring any bells. I don't know if I've ever come across that book.
Okay.
1925. No, I don't think so.
All right. Just wanted to ask. I'm too tired to talk. I'll see you next week.
See you next week. Hope you're feeling better by then.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.